Welcome, Vitaємо, to Осередок Ukrainian Cultural and Educational Center's lecture, David Burliuk's Journey, Three Continents in the Enduring Ukrainian Inspiration, with Professor Myroslav Shkandrij. This event will take place in English with the opportunity to ask questions in either English or Ukrainian. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Myroslav Shkandrij, the curator of exhibits here at Осередок, and it is my pleasure to be the moderator this evening. It is doubly my pleasure because, yes, our special guest today is my father. Вітаємо вас на цю подію осередка «Подорож Давида Бурлюка» з професором Myroslavom Shkandrijem. Я Олександра Шкандрій, куратор виставок тут в осередку, і нині вечором буду переводити ваші питання професору Шкандрійові. Ми хотіли почати з визначення того, що земля, на котрій відбувається ця подія, Вінніпех, є традиційна територія багатьох націй, включно з Анішинабе, Інівак, Анішинавак, Дакота, Дене і Métis людьми. Ми також визнаваємо, що Вінніпех підпадає під дію договору 1. Осередок Ukrainian Cultural and Educational Center is located on Treaty 1 territory, the original lands and waters of Anishinaabe, Innuak, Anishinaabeg, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. Для тих, котрі не знайомі з осередком української культури і освіти, ми різноманітна організація тут в центрі Вінніпега. Осередок музей, картинна галерея, архів і бібліотека. Осередок також громадянський культурний центр, в котрому проведені події, курси та культурні програми. For those who are unfamiliar with Осередок Ukrainian Cultural and Educational Center, we're a multifaceted organization located in the heart of Winnipeg. Osseredok serves as a museum, art gallery, archive, and library, as well as a community center and cultural hub. Programming in Osseredok includes various workshops, educational courses, and events like tonight's lecture. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce you to our guest, Professor Myroslav Shkandrij. Myroslav Shkandrij is Professor Emeritus at the University of Manitoba, where he taught Slavic studies. He has published books on Ukraine in the 1920s, Ukrainian-Russian relations, nationalism, and avant-garde art. He has curated a number of exhibitions dealing with the early 20th century avant-garde and has translated several Ukrainian authors into English. In the fall 2021 semester, he was a visiting professor at the Harriman Institute at Columbia University. Welcome, Vitaємо.
Дякую, thank you. So, thanks for that introduction. Can you see the screen?
Just about. Perfect, дякую.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to be in Osseredok. I am often asked about Burliuk and about his background, whether he was Ukrainian, whether he felt Ukrainian. So this talk kind of came out of thinking about those issues. I've studied Burliuk, I've studied his archives, and I've always found him a fascinating character. He spanned 3 continents, and that means Europe, Eurasia, Asia, and North America. And he continued producing an incredible amount of work over a lifetime. He's also the founder of futurism in the Russian Empire and in Japan. He's really quite a remarkable figure. So what I'm going to try and do is explain his journey through life, through art, but also what I think is the basic inspiration that never left him, that you have to understand if you want to understand who Burliuk was. He was born in 1882 very near Sumy in northern Ukraine, and a place that now doesn't exist. It was a homestead, but it's now been leveled, and they are thinking of building a museum there. He's best known as a painter, but he was also a poet, wrote in Russian, but with Ukrainian words sometimes thrown in. And he's known as the father of futurism in the Russian Empire. He called himself father of futurism, Российского futurisma, which means not Ruskого, not Russian, ethnic Russian, but futurism in the state, the Russian state, the empire. His futurism, like all futurisms at the beginning of the century, the turn of the 20th century, was a rupture with academic styles. It put a premium on innovation, on movement, on dynamism, on new perceptions, and on shocking the taste of authorities, established taste. He studied in Odessa and then in Kazan in Russia, in the Munich Royal Academy of Arts, in Odessa Art School, and the Moscow Art School. And he traveled quite a bit because his father was an estate manager and was moved around. But most famously, he managed this huge, enormous estate in Chernyanka, in Ukrainian, Chernyanka in Russian, very close to Kherson. And that's where he gathered the first futurist group, the so-called Hylaea group. And that's where the first manifestos were produced and published. This group included all the big stars of futurism at that time, pre-1914. He participated in the Der Blaue Reiter, the Blue Rider exhibition in Munich, 1912, along with Picasso, Klee, Kandinsky, and others. This was the exhibition that really put futurism and the new arts on the map. He helped organize the first exhibitions, which were in Kiev, Odessa, then St. Petersburg, Moscow. And he toured, along with Vladimir Mayakovsky and Vasily Kamensky and others, he toured 17 cities in the empire with his performance art, at which they would insult the audience, they would argue with them, they would read poetry, they would give lectures. At one point, they hung a grand piano from the ceiling, and they had a tea party under it. And when they finished drinking the tea, they would flick the dregs at the audience, just challenging. He loved to do this. He loved the hecklers, and he loved to challenge people. So it was a sensation. But then he traveled through these three continents, and he went through various styles: impressionism, cubo-futurism, neo-primitivism, abstract art, and then in the United States, radio art, surrealism, politics, political art, naive ethnographic scenes. So here's the big problem. Here's a person who launched a major movement, but then embraced various styles. He produced something around 17,000 works, maybe more. He never stopped working. We know about some of his constants: passion for life, boundless energy, search for self-expression. But how do we make sense of this changing styles? How do we encapsulate this evolution as a whole? I'm going to try and answer this question. Here are some of the neo-primitivist works that he produced right at the beginning of the futurist movement. They are inspired by the Scythian artifacts. He and his brother used to go digging the kurhane, the burial mounds, pulling out Scythian plates, skeletons, all sorts of artifacts. And among them were these Scythian designs. They were on round plates. You could move them around, see them from different sides. And Burliuk then got the idea of producing art that you could turn upside down and see from different angles. Horses were a big Scythian thing, animals. So Burliuk did this. But he also did this kind of cubo-futurist broken image, which was popular at the time. And this particular painting, The Marriage Proposal, was in the the Blue Rider exhibition in Munich, the famous one of 1912. Now, I have to say that not all these images are the originals. When Burliuk came to the United States, he signed a contract without carefully reading the small print, and a rather unscrupulous dealer took a lot of his original works because he had signed them off in this contract. So Burliuk made copies, and sometimes he put down the original date on the copies. So you will see in a moment, some of these works are double dated. This is from the cubo-futurist period when he was experimenting. Here's another one of the Bricklayer from 1912. And here are very typical paintings playing with cubo-futurism, but very much the Ukrainian landscape. He kept returning to windmills, horses, Ukrainian girls, flowers, a little bit of eroticism as well, remembering his youth, his childhood. These are the paintings that stayed with him. And I'm going to argue that this was, in many ways, the inspiration that kept him going. Here's another one, an early one. Well, we call it The Man with Three Faces, but it's not described. It has a lot of energy in it, a lot of color. You know, you can feel the beating down of the sun in Ukraine, in the southern parts of Ukraine. The animals, the farms. And then a bit later, he began experimenting in different styles. So here you have neomorphism. It was painted in 1918. It was one of the paintings that Burliuk lost. So he repainted it in the 1960s. Here's another one, movement, waves. Like all the futurists, he was fascinated by movement and by these camera takes, different snaps from stills from a camera. And here's Dance, another work that he did in 1910, but he repainted in 1962. So movement, this angular play with forms was very important. But he also went into this kind of metaphysical, semi-mystical thing. And some of his paintings, even from the early part of his life, have this mysterious, suggestive quality. Here's one called Captain. Now, when the revolution came, he was no proletarian. He decided that he would travel across Siberia. In order to do so, he had to give concerts everywhere he went. And here's a poster from one of these concerts, a lecture, an evening with David Burliuk, the futurist poet, and others. There's going to be a showing of pictures, and it's all going to be between realism and futurism. He would do this, and he would sell his paintings, sometimes just do a lot of portraits because they were popular, portraits and landscapes. And he would put them on fences and sell them to get himself and his family across Siberia. Here are some examples of the portraits. They were rather good. You can see people would buy these, and he knew how to first of all to busk, to get people into the halls, to get them interested, but also he played to popular taste, and some of these portraits sold well. Here's a self-portrait from that period, from 1920s, as he was crisscrossing Siberia. And here's a landscape as he moved through Siberia. Again, really well done. I mean, not necessarily cubo-futurist, more impressionist, but very, very, very successful. Chelyabinsk, right in the Far East. Vladivostok, a view from his apartment. The basement was filled with water. It was the revolution, post-revolutionary years. Burliuk opened a cabaret and he did various performances there. But he was looking to get out. His brother had been shot on Red Square. His brother had been in the Tsarist army. He himself knew quite a bit about the Bolsheviks, and he knew he was in some danger. In fact, he was warned. As the trains moved across Siberia, he would be told when there would be a hand inspection at the next station. And a hand inspection was done to see if you had calloused hands. If you weren't, you were a bourgeois and you were likely to be arrested or shot. So Burliuk was keen to get out, and he made enough money to get himself on his passage to Japan. And here he continued with this futurist style. A lot of it was colorful, but a lot of it was also about movement. Here he's trying to capture movement in a train in Japan. He stayed there for 2 years. His sons began to learn Japanese and started dressing as Japanese. They looked like little Japanese kids. Viktor Palmov was with him. Palmov later went back to Kiev and worked in Kiev as a colorist. Became famous for his colorist works. And here is his wife, Marusia, 1922 in Japan. He painted many, many portraits of her. She was also of gentry family, upper gentry family, very well educated, and played the piano very well. And in one of the reminiscences, she had several pianos, but she couldn't take them with her. So at one point, they unloaded the pianos. I think there were 7 or 9, I'm not sure how many. She played each one and left them in the steppe and then moved on. Here's a Japanese woman from 1921. But to make money, he had to do landscapes, which were quite popular. And here is a landscape. Many of these were bought by people with substantial money, including rulers of states. He actually displayed them. He organized his own displays in department stores, which were a big thing in Japan and a good place to do this. And to get people to come in, he would do these brochures. Each one of them, he would do a quick sketch on. So each one was unique with a Burliuk image on them. And then, having made enough money, he moved to New York in 1922, where in the 20s and 30s, he worked as an art editor of a leftist daily called the Ruski Golos, the Russian Voice. He was friends with a lot of emigres from the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union, including a lot of Jewish artists and Russian artists and Ukrainian artists. Here is a portrait by Nikolai Tsiskovsky of Burliuk, the way he looked at that time. And this is where he lived, Bedford Avenue, Brooklyn. For a while, quite poor, without running water, but later he got to make money. On Brighton Beach, Vladimir Mayakovsky came to visit him. Brighton Beach is still a place where a lot of Ukrainian and Russian emigres hang out. And here he is sketching on the beach. Probably his biggest success was developing what he called the radiostyle. This was around about 1926, around there. He was a bit of a visionary, and he was able to convince people that he could see radio waves. This is his interpretation of the electric station on one of the rivers in Manhattan. Here's a Dickman Ferry from 1925. Again, you can sort of see waves, magnetic, electrical waves, radio waves in the sky. And he did quite a few of these. The Radio-Style Manifesto from 1926 spoke about a new age of cosmopolitanism, about the power of the telescope. It instructed people that they had more than 5 senses, they just didn't know about the others. He talked about a new kinetic and dynamic age, and about the importance of slow sight, the ability to grasp all parts of an action like frames in a film sequence. The invisible extension of forms and the connection between past, present, and future. And then also in the early 30s, he went into a sort of a surrealist phase. This is Court Lunch, where he portrays West 10th Street. It's about 1930. Again, mysterious, a little bit of that night scenery, a kind of an oddness to it. Here's Welcome Island with some very attractive naked ladies under umbrellas, and the beloved horses on the island, beckoning to sailors who are very happy to come and visit them. And here's another mysterious one. This one is, unlocking the secrets of nature. You can see the wind blowing at the top, kissing the mountain. And the mountain itself is has secrets that need unlocking. All the instruments you see are instruments that enable you to figure out what nature is, what it is hiding. And this is part of Burliuk's enduring inspiration. Whereas other futurists went in for mechanical things, machines, the speed of airplanes and motor cars, Burliuk was much more grounded in natural phenomena. Towards the end of the 30s, the early 40s, he had a resurgence in his career. This was a time when the United States was allied to the Soviet Union and was fighting Nazi Germany. And various exhibitions were organized to raise money for the war. Burliuk felt quite at home in this period. And these are children of Stalingrad. He showed on the left the destruction of Stalingrad, and on the right, the reconstruction afterwards. The children portrayed there are actually children from his own family, grandchildren. And as you can see, there's Lenin and there is Stalin. And then out the window, you see this beautiful new world that's about to be created. But Burliuk was he was not particularly communist or Marxist. I've already mentioned that he had problems with the Bolsheviks. This is his portrait of Lenin and Tolstoy from 1944. I'm not sure whether it's a view of New York from New Jersey or maybe from Brooklyn. But the idea is straightforward. Lenin is the new tiller of the soil. You can see the sun on his clothing. Tolstoy is the old tiller of the soil, the old instructor. The moon is on his clothing. But in fact, Burliuk was far closer to Tolstoy. He admired Tolstoy very much. He read Tolstoy, he quoted Tolstoy. He called Tolstoy the gentle Bolshevik, which would be a shock to most Bolsheviks, but this was how he viewed Tolstoy, and it's also a signal as to what he thought of the Bolsheviks. After the war, he began to travel. He made quite a lot of money in it from selling paintings in the radiostyle, which are very popular still. They hang in many university museums and galleries. He got fascinated by Van Gogh, and he would travel regularly to France, to Arles, where Van Gogh painted, and he would kind of imitate Van Gogh. Cafe scenes of the village, which he loved doing. Strong colors, a kind of a zest for life comes through them. And he did the same when he moved back. He did paintings of East Coast villages. This is Preception Bay. Interesting thing about this one is the impasto style. If you see it from the side, it's extremely thick. I mean, the paints were just squeezed out of tubes directly onto the canvas. Now, this is important. Burliuk only had one eye. He lost an eye playing with a cannon, a toy cannon, as a child. He looked into the barrel of the cannon, it went off and it blew out his eye. So Burliuk needed to get very close to paintings. And he actually wrote a whole dissertation on the texture of paintings. And he talked about a sandy texture, a smooth texture, a thick texture, a spiky texture, a shiny texture. He was very much interested in that sort of up-close feel. And he actually looked at nature in that way too, very close at objects in nature, almost a microscopic view. And then he tried to sort of translate that. But the other part of what he was doing at this time was enjoying comradeship, enjoying the friendship of common people. He loved to do parties, groups of people getting together. This is the ethnographic style that he developed after that, the 40s. And here's a great one, Your Fortune Told. It's actually listed as, it's identified as First Avenue and 3rd Street, New York, way down there in what is still, for many people, a sketchy part of New York. Here's By My Fish, Smiling Dish. Well, quite fun. And part of this enjoyment of human interaction. Here's another one. Drink milk. He loved these scenes of people sitting around, chatting, exchanging information, telling jokes. But he was also terrific at self-presentation. You know, that colorful jacket of his, the top hat, the waistcoat, were all part of selling himself. including the earrings. And he continued to do that. He presented himself, and he was also careful not to offend the Soviet Union because he wanted to visit again. And they allowed him to go back. So in '56, he visited Crimea, and here's a painting of Bakhchisarai. And then in '65, he made his final trip with his wife. They went to Moscow, where they were sort of wined and dined. After all, he was quite well known by that time. And here he is in Moscow with his wife. But he's a crafty chap. So he did portraits, for example, of Mayakovsky in 1930. Mayakovsky committed suicide in 1930. He was supposedly the great Soviet poet, but only parts of Mayakovsky's verse were reproduced for many, many years in the Soviet Union. The great Mayakovsky, the tortured, creative, erotic Mayakovsky was often not was frowned upon. It was only the propagandist that was reproduced. And so Burliuk, when he painted, he often left messages like this. This is Mayakovsky trapped, unsure which way to go, not sure of his direction. A veiled comment on what the Soviet Union had done to the great futurist poet and his very close friend, the person whom he actually brought into the literary field, Vladimir Mayakovsky. Later in life, he lived on Long Island, which was in a cottage that had been gifted him by an admirer. Continued to paint every day. The cottage is just chock-a-block with paintings. Even the garage, which he built himself, has this enormous fresco in it. You cannot possibly see it or film it. You have to walk around in a circle to film it. I don't think it's ever been shown. And he continued to paint, very often turning to nature or to family history, nostalgic pieces about his youth, his childhood. So here are some examples of great, paintings of still lifes. These wonderful lilacs that look real. A little bit of shardism, a little bit of the angular in this one, but a nice painting. But he also used to go back to his Ukrainian roots. Now, I haven't told you, but Burliuk was of Zaporozhian Cossack origin. He was very proud of that. And in Syracuse Library, there is a family tree in which a Cossack is right at the base of the tree, and then all the family members are portrayed as growing out of this. Burliuk returned to this image of Cossack Mamai many times. Again, it sort of always had a horse. It always has the food, the drink, the bandura or the instrument, the sword, and this image of the steppe. He also produced earrings constantly. In the Zaporozhian style, he would wear only one in one ear. These are his earrings. And this is a photograph from the 30s with his two sons. And you can see in the background, already in the 30s, he was doing these little gnome-like figures, these pictures of landscapes, and these images of the Ukraine that he left behind. These were very admired. Even Henry Miller when he saw an exhibition in California, wrote to Burliuk saying how he was so impressed with these colorful, powerful pictures. And they remained sort of a calling card of Burliuk. He wasn't always in a happy mood. Life was tough for immigrants. And here's a portrait of two aging people in Trenton, New Jersey. But these are the paintings that he loved doing the most. And they're very much that Ukrainian inspiration. He did dolls, Ukrainian dolls for his grandchildren. He did these paintings of Ukrainian girls. Another very heavily impasteled painting. And at the very end of his life, when he found it difficult to hold onto his paintbrush, he would lean over these little blocks, and you can see they're very tiny, some of them, but they were like a coda. He went through all the styles. So my conclusion, yes, he was a rule breaker. He challenges accepted tastes, explored organic materials and processes. He loved this microscopic view. He was and believed in intuitive, mystical visions and understandings of nature, in sensing cosmic vibrations. But he was basically a worshiper of the earth, not of technology, not of the powers of nature, not of the dominance of the machine. So he was no proletarian, of course. He was very cautious about the Soviet regime. He saw the past in the present very clearly. He was fascinated by his family history. That famous Repin painting of the Zaporozhians writing a letter to the Sultan of Turkey, everybody in Burliuk's family thought that the semi-naked Cossack in the front was Burliuk's father. He did portraits of Sahidachny, Cossack Mamai. He read Yuri Kosach, a Ukrainian writer in emigration, and he self-identified as a Ukrainian. He was inspired by early contact with nature, and that stayed with him. So yes, he sought to open doors of perception through experimentation, to discover hidden mechanisms, connections, and patterns. But there was this constant in his life, this Ukrainian inspiration. So I hope that's useful for you people.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We'll all raise a hand to you. Thank you for being here. And now, if there are any questions from the audience, we'll open it up. My first question, though, is can you tell us a little bit more about his identification as a Ukrainian?
Yes, very gladly. This was one of the questions that was I've always been asked this constantly. I'll tell you one interesting anecdote. When I was in New York, I visited the Ukrainian archives there, UVAN, Ukrainian Free Academy of Sciences. And one of the people working there was Pani Radish, Mrs. Radish, who was the daughter of a Professor Myroslav. Now in the 50s or 60s, they went to visit Burliuk. And they were a little afraid. They weren't quite sure what to expect. But when they knocked on the door, Burliuk's wife came, Marusia, came to the door. And when they announced who they were, she said, "Oh, my husband is a Ukrainian. He'll be thrilled to talk to you." So they had a long conversation with him. He spoke perfect Ukrainian. He was very proud of the fact that he was Ukrainian, identified as a Ukrainian. And actually, they taped the conversation. He spoke Ukrainian. So I tell people this all the time. UVAN has to find that tape, because somewhere in UVAN there is a tape, or there's somewhere in Pani Radish's archives, there is a tape of Burliuk speaking Ukrainian. And he was quite proud of the fact that he was Ukrainian. In his memoirs, he actually wrote about that. He said something to the effect that there is no truer son of Ukraine than myself. My colors are Ukrainian. My love of the sunlight and the earth is Ukrainian. And you can see that in his paintings.
Thank you. One of the other things that you mentioned when you were talking about some of his, earlier manifestos, his earlier ideas, like the radiostyle manifesto, this idea of a new age of cosmopolitanism, like he seems really quite optimistic, not only in the words he uses and the colors that he uses. Like, is this an accurate reading of him? Like, how does that, how did he cope with these huge changes that he lived through in his life?
That's a great observation, and I'll tell you why, because I think that is one of the keys to understanding him. He was, you could never put him down. He would always bounce back. Think about it. He went through the revolution. He lost everything. He went through Siberia, traveled through Siberia twice, caught typhoid, recovered, started life anew in Japan, started life anew in the United States, was very poor for a long period of time. But he was always one of these people who were built for success. And he, nothing could keep him down. He kept talking about the fact, first of all, he had a powerful constitution. He kept talking about the fact that he had Ukrainian Cossack bones. Nothing could keep him down. He had enormous energy, always sort of spoiling for a fight. And this is a guy who spoke no English, washed up in Manhattan. He convinced somebody to organize an exhibition of his paintings. In that weird costume with his painted face, his top hat and his earring, he actually walked across Manhattan because he didn't have money for the subway or the streetcar. He walked across Manhattan, stood outside, and he busked, "Come see great futurist poet and painter, world famous futurist painter." And he just sort of dragged people in. This was a person who was just built for success. And he eventually did have success. Those paintings, the radiostyle, they went for like hundreds of thousands of dollars. They were snapped up by some very astute collectors. And I think he was just, whatever opening was available, he would take it. As styles changed, he would move into a new style. As one door closed, he would look for another door to open. And I think that is part of that Ukrainian, love of life and optimism, and sense that that you're never powerless. There's always, first of all, life is interesting. There's always something interesting to figure out. But he also, I think, just adored life. People would stand next to him painting radio waves in the sky, and he would talk to them. And by the end of the conversation, they'd become convinced that they too could see the radio waves in the air. It was just one of these guys that just conveyed a love of the environment. So I think he has a lot to teach. I must say also that he wasn't the easiest guy to get on with. So, for example, he had this fixation about nature being able to take care of itself. You could not, for example, switch on a hose and water things. If you did, it'd come around and switch off the hose. As far as he was concerned, nature knew best. leave it alone. Things, things would come up of their own account. But I think that's part of the optimism. He came from the southern steppes from Ukraine, where everything grows, where the black earth just makes everything fruitful. Nature is prolific, it is bountiful, it just allows for mistakes to be made, and it regenerates. And I think that's one of the keys to understanding him. So yeah, I think I agree entirely that this optimism is part of his art and is part of his worldview.
Thank you. I have another question here is, can you talk a little bit more about Yuri Cossack? Were he and Burliuk personally acquainted? Can you tell us a few more details about them?
I believe they were not acquainted, but the interesting thing here is that Cossack wrote some very interesting works in emigration after the war about, the Cossack past. About Cossacks in the 17th, 18th century. And Cossack did not get on well with what you might call the mainstream Ukrainian community, the political community, the emigres. He also played a careful game with the Soviet Union, and in fact edited a journal that was seen as pro-Soviet, actually got money from the Soviet Union to publish this for a while. And like Burliuk, Cossack was invited to visit the Soviet Union a couple of times. This, of course, made his name mud in the political emigre community, much of it anyway. But, he sort of played this game rather well. So he might have been known and accepted and admired in some of the leftist emigre community, which was where Burliuk hung out rather carefully, but still hung out. So it might be that Cossack's works were known and recommended to Burliuk. We know for sure that he tried to get them, ordered them, and read them.
And another question that I have here is, can you elaborate a little bit about the reproductions? Where are they? What happened to the originals? What's the story around these recreated works?
Oh, this is a fascinating question. I don't have the answer to that, but I know that he was absolutely furious when he was, in his view, conned out of these early works. And he deliberately went out of his way to make the copies. So where some of these are not big, they're not very powerful big works. In fact, they may have been kept by Burliuk for sentimental value because they were the earliest, the first that he did. So I don't know where they are. I believe that Burliuk's granddaughter, Mary Holt, who lives in Canada and who has most of his works, has quite a few of these early works. And she also has many of the repainted works. Now, it's not just that he was upset with the fact that he lost these works. There's a bit of a competition going on here for who painted the first new art, the first cubo-futurist work. And it may have been that Burliuk wanted to show that he got in there first. So he may have predated some works. We're not sure about that either. Yeah, no, he was a futurist after all. He played games, he enjoyed this stuff, and he might have actually, because he was a showman, he might actually have done this deliberately. I was told, for example, by his granddaughter that he tried to get everybody in the family to paint, and he actually exhibited his children, his family members, alongside himself. And sometimes when one of the grandchildren produced a rather interesting little painting on a block, he would take it, sign it, and exhibit it as his own. So it's kind of something in between found art and repainted art. He would do that occasionally, maybe for a joke, or maybe just because he was a futurist. Futurists can do that.
Okay, and one final question that I have is, how was he received by his contemporaries? Like, how was he integrated into the broader futurist community? You mentioned him in Munich and in Paris, and working with a lot of other artists.
He was futurism. He was the man. A lot of scholars have said, without Burliuk, there would not have been a futurism in the Russian Empire. That's a quote from Vladimir Markov, one of the first critics and scholars of futurism. He was Mr. Futurism. And he, because of his connections with Kandinsky, with Munich and so on, and with artists in Ukraine, he was instrumental in those earliest exhibitions, Odessa, Kiev, then Moscow, St. Petersburg. So he was definitely known. He was the one that pulled together that futurist group. All those Khrushchev and Mayakovsky, Lifshitz, and all these people, they visited the estate, where his father worked, this huge estate in the Kherson area. They lived there. Every summer they would visit, they lived, and they hatched their various projects. And Burliuk was the driving force. He was the engine. He was the one that made it happen. And more than that, all of these people, if you read Benedict Lifshitz's memoirs, The 1.5-Eyed Archer, it's beautiful memoir, really nicely written. He has a chapter there about the Hylaea group in Kherson. And he says that Burliuk was, everybody felt that Burliuk was extremely Ukrainian. They all knew that the family was Ukrainian. They sort of thought this was what Ukrainians were like. You know, they're all extremely generous. They eat a lot. They're huge. The entire family were like massive. The women were Amazons. The men were like giants. And they admired this family, which they knew were Ukrainian. But they also, you know, this was part of the futurist DNA. You know, we are against the effete world of symbolism. We come from the steppe. We are the raw, powerful people of the earth. It was part of the image.
No, thank you so much for this lecture. We are so grateful to have had you here at Осередок. Thank you for sharing your knowledge about Burliuk. Дуже дякую вам за дуже цікавий доповідь. And with that, we'll say good night. До побачення.
До побачення.